"Stop touching the good plates! You're not family!" my daughter-in-law hissed. I didn't argue. I reached for the deed instead. By the end of the week, my signature was the only one that mattered. Theirs was gone from the paperwork, the plans, and the future they thought was theirs. I'd spent years making this house a home. Now it was mine alone. And when they came for it, the documents would answer for me. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The first fork sang against the oak tabletop like a tuning note, bright and thin, and Maggie Collins knew the room would remember if she let herself tremble. She steadied her hands. The dining room in Ardsley Park breathed old Savannah, crown molding crisp as a collar, windows tall enough to drink the late summer light, a ceiling fan spinning lazily above the chandelier. She laid the forks in a neat parade beside the dinner plates she'd pulled from the everyday stack, white stoneware, serviceable, no flourish. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil, starch from the ironed linens, and something buttery drifting in from the kitchen where Brittany liked to perform being hostess. 4 settings, Maggie murmured, more to the table than to herself. David, Brittany, me, and the space where dignity sits. She moved to the china cabinet, a handsome glass-fronted sentinel that had traveled with her through homes and years, its shelves catching sunlight and turning it into soft champagne. Inside, the good plates waited. Bone china with cobalt rims and a spray of gold wheat at the edge, the pattern delicate as breath. Sunday deserved grace. She reached in, fingers slipping around the familiar thinness. The sound of porcelain ticking gently against porcelain like polite applause. Brittany's reflection arrived first, a smear of blonde hair and a fitted dress, before Brittany herself, one hand on the cabinet door above Maggie's. "Stop!" She didn't quite touch Maggie, but her voice did, a little hiss that cooled the room. "Stop touching the good plates. You're not family." Silence found the corners. Even the fan seemed to hesitate. Maggie's hand paused mid-air. She could feel the plate's weight, warmer where her fingers met it, the gold rim flashing like a tiny ring of sun. She set it back against its stack without a scrape, careful as a surgeon, then closed the cabinet as though nothing had been disturbed, as though the words hadn't scuffed the floor of the evening. From the kitchen, David appeared carrying a casserole dish with a pot holder that had seen better days. His eyes, his father's eyes, fixed on the cabinet, then on Brittany, then on his mother. For a breath, he was a child again, trying to read the weather. He blinked and pasted on a smile. "Okay," he said too loudly. "So, shrimp and grits turned out great. Smells like the gray." He laughed at his own joke and set the dish down. The ceramic thud an awkward period. Brittany fluffed an invisible cushion on a chair and straightened her already straight place card. "We have guests next week," she announced to the air. "I'm saving the china for people who appreciate presentation." Maggie busied herself with the napkins. "Of course," she said. Her voice didn't break. It didn't even bend. "Mom, you don't have to," David began. "I know what I have to do," Maggie replied, folding a navy linen square into a simple bishop's hat, crisp edges kissing. She laid it at Brittany's place, then at David's, then at her own. Brittany's heels clicked across the hardwood as she circled the room, adjusting a candlestick a quarter inch, nudging a chair back flush with the rug's border. "We're trying to keep things elevated," she said, hands making a rising motion. "Consistency matters." "Consistency," Maggie said, placing the last everyday plate with exactly the care she would have lavished on porcelain, like manners. Brittany's smile sharpened. "Like boundaries." David coughed into his fist. Let's sit. Food's hot." He poured sweet tea into glasses, ice cracking like distant fireworks. The first sip burned cold at the back of Maggie's throat. She folded her hands in her lap and watched David spoon the creamy grits, the plump shrimp striped pink and white and dusted with scallions. Brittany kept her phone face down beside her, a little black slab glinting with the promise of somewhere else. They ate, or pretended to. Conversation skirted weather and a newly paved stretch of Bull Street. When Brittany spoke, she leaned on certain words as if they were furniture only she could afford. "David and I are really finding our rhythm with the house," she said. "It's just ours, you know? Our little world." The word ours brushed past Maggie like a shoulder in a crowded hallway. She reached for her glass instead of a plate. She wasn't family enough to touch, and let the tea's sweetness settle the taste of unsaid things. She could feel David wanting to change the subject, to unspool a rope ladder over the pit that had opened, but he couldn't meet her eyes. Brittany texted someone beneath the table, thumbs quick, mouth pinched in satisfied concentration. "Dessert?" Maggie asked when her plate was still half full. "I brought lemon bars." "We're watching Sugar," Brittany said. Her lips curved in that gracious, pageant-ready way that had a mean seam stitched tight inside it. "But thanks." Maggie nodded. She collected her words and stacked them neatly in her chest. There was no tremor in her fingers as she lifted her own plate and carried it to the sink. At the cabinet again, she opened the glass door. Not for the good dishes this time, but for the violet glass vase Brittany liked to keep empty because negative space photographs well. Maggie took it out, set it on the sideboard, and eased the door closed, listening to that delicate click that used to mean home. David cleared his throat. "Hey, we should go to Forsyth next weekend. Walk the park." "That sounds lovely," Maggie said. She turned toward him and smiled at the fact of him, the boy and the man overlapping in her mind like two transparencies, but she kept the overlap to herself. No flash of past, only the present, his jaw a little tighter than usual, the faint grease of worry on his brow. "Text me the time." "Yes," Brittany cut in. "We'll have to see. We've got things." "Of course you do," Maggie said, and the words were not sharp. They were cloth folded over a blade. After dinner, she rinsed her plate, dried it, and set it back in the stack with the others, quiet, precise, no chip, no complaint. She wiped the counter clean with small, efficient circles. In the reflection of the dark window above the sink, she saw the room behind her, the chandelier throwing warm coins of light on the table, Brittany tapping her phone, David collecting forks with the care of a man dismantling a bomb. She gathered her purse from the hall tree. "Thank you for supper," she said, and meant it for the food, if not the evening. "Drive safe," David said. He almost touched her shoulder, and then did not. Outside, the air held the soft weight of savanna humidity, jasmine sweet even at night. Live oaks arched over the street like old guardians, their beards of moss silver in the porch lights. Maggie's shoes made a measured sound on the walk. She sat in her car and let the engine idle without shifting into reverse, palms flat on the wheel until the heat dropped to a gentler breeze. Her phone buzzed in the console. Lillian's name lit the screen. Maggie answered on the second ring. "Evening." "I heard your voice in my head all day," Lillian said. No hello, just that truth-teller's tone she'd had since high school, dry as good gin. "Something happen?" Maggie stared at the house, at the second-floor window where the master bedroom lamp glowed buttery and unbothered. Through the sheer drape, a figure moved. Brittany, probably, crossing the light like a cloud. "What makes you ask?" Maggie said, and her voice was steady enough to fool a stranger. "Because I know you," Lillian replied. Paper rustled on her end. A habit, always sorting, always ready. "And because I had a feeling about tonight." "Tell me what she said." Maggie's finger hovered over the ignition, then dropped to quiet the engine. The house lights looked suddenly colder. She took a breath, tasting lemon, starch, and something metallic she refused to name. "She told me I'm not family," Maggie said. There was the briefest silence, then Lillian's tone sharpened, all softness snapped out of it. "Do you still have the papers?" she asked. "Mags, tell me you still have the papers." The porch light flicked on, flooding the walkway with brittle brightness, and the front door cracked as if someone might step out, right as Maggie drew the phone tight to her ear and decided whether to answer. The next morning, the house felt smaller than it had the night before, though Maggie wasn't in it. She sat at her own kitchen table, the quiet steady as breath, a second cup of coffee cooling beside her. In the drawer to her left, under the dish towels and the rubber bands and the little notebook where she still jotted grocery prices, lay the key to the safe. She hadn't touched it in years. The safe squatted in the back of her bedroom closet, behind a cedar chest and an old quilt rack. She pulled the chain on the bare bulb overhead, light falling in a tight cone on dust and shadows. The dial felt cold and faintly greasy from disuse. She turned it slow, passed the first number twice, passed the second once, passed the third until the tumblers caught with a sound she felt more than heard. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper and metal. Her will, her marriage certificate, old bonds her husband had called just in case. And, toward the back, an envelope heavy enough to bend under its own contents. She carried it to the bed and slid the documents free, their edges rasping softly. The title deed to the Ardsley Park house was crisp, its embossed seal catching the morning light like a coin. Her name sat there in black ink beside David's, two owners divided by a neat comma. No Brittany. Her thumb rested on her name a long moment. Ink couldn't erase what Brittany had said last night, but it could draw a sharper line. She called Lillian. Her friend answered with a simple, "Well?" "She's not on it," Maggie said, and it came out almost like a laugh, dry, without humor. "Of course she's not," Lillian replied. Maggie could hear her shuffling through something, probably one of the manila folders she kept within arm's reach even in retirement. "That girl's got all the legal standing of a potted plant. Without your signature, she couldn't sell a coat hook off that wall, and she sure as sunrise can't throw you out." Maggie traced the embossed seal with her nail. "Good to know." "More than good. It's power," Lillian said. "Don't you go forgetting that, Mags." Later that afternoon, she made another call, to Robert Ames. His voice was exactly as she remembered from the last time they'd crossed paths, low and deliberate, the kind that slowed your own speech in reply. "Yes, Maggie, you can sell your interest, gift it, will it away, whatever you choose," he said. "As long as you're listed as a joint owner, your share is yours alone to dispose of. No one else's consent required." She let the words settle. In the silence that followed, Robert added, "You sound resolute." "I suppose I am." When she hung up, her mind slipped backward, uninvited but insistent, to the day the papers were first signed. David's hand had been young then, uncalloused by mortgages and marriage. They'd sat together in a closing office, smelling faintly of printer toner and old coffee, the pen heavy in her grip. She'd written the check from the account her husband left her, the one she'd guarded so carefully after the funeral. David hadn't asked, not outright, but she'd seen the worry in his eyes, the way he'd looked at the down payment total like it was a wave he couldn't swim through alone. She'd been proud to help. Now she wondered if Brittany even knew that history. She put the deed back in its envelope but didn't return it to the safe. Instead, she set it on the hall table where its weight could greet her each time she passed. By early evening, the sun was low enough to paint the street in gold. Maggie brewed tea and carried it to her porch, the kind of day where even the air seemed to hang and listen. She was halfway through her cup when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A notification from social media, she rarely checked it, popped up anyway. A photograph loaded slowly on the screen. Brittany and David standing in front of the Ardsley Park house. Brittany's smile wide and possessive, one hand resting theatrically on the porch column. The caption read, "Our home, our haven. Love building a life together. Blessed." There was no sign of Maggie. Not in the photo. Not in the words. She stared at the image until the light behind it dimmed with the evening. Then she set her phone down and, with a steadiness that felt almost dangerous, reached for her notebook. She uncapped her pen. On the first line, she wrote 3 words in neat block letters, "Call Clive Warren." The bell above the door of Perk and Parcel chimed twice as Maggie stepped in, the air conditioning cutting through the damp warmth of late-morning Savannah. The cafe smelled of espresso and buttered croissants, the kind of scent that convinced people their lives could be sorted out at a small table with the right friend. Lillian was already there, back to the wall, legal pad open beside a mug gone cold. Her reading glasses hung halfway down her nose, a silver pen tapping lightly on the pad. She looked up once, gave a small nod that said, "Sit, we're working," and returned to her notes. Maggie set her tote bag on the chair and slid in opposite. The property listings were already spread across the table, printouts from the county records website, some with Lillian's tidy handwriting in the margins. "These," Lillian said, tapping 3 pages with the blunt end of her pen, "are the last 6 months in Ardsley Park. You'll notice a name that keeps showing up." Maggie leaned closer. The font was small, the deeds drier than dust, but she saw it. Clive Warren, listed as the buyer on 4 addresses she recognized from Sunday walks. All closed quickly, all for cash. "Investor?" Maggie asked. "Predator," Lillian said, though her tone carried no heat, just the fact of it. "Knows the value of a historic roofline, and he pays for it before anyone else can blink." They sipped coffee as the conversation slid into numbers. Lillian had circled sale prices, cross-referenced square footage, and highlighted terms like no contingencies and as is. Maggie's own home, she realized, could sit near the top of that list, its wide porch and symmetrical windows worth far more than sentiment alone. Lillian's phone was already in hand. "Want me to reach out? I still know half the people in the recorder's office." Maggie shook her head, the motion deliberate. "I'll do it." 2 hours later, her phone screen lit with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was smooth, masculine, and unhurried. "Maggie Collins," he said, as if tasting the syllables. "I hear you might have something of interest to me." They agreed to meet the next afternoon at the Collins House Hotel, a quiet spot on Barnard Street where business could pass for socializing. He'd know her by the book in her hand. She'd know him by the boutonniere he claimed he always wore for luck. When Maggie arrived, he was exactly as she expected. Late 50s, tanned but not leathery, dressed in a seersucker jacket and polished loafers without socks. A small white carnation was pinned to his lapel. He smiled like a man who'd learned long ago that smiling could open more doors than pushing. They talked value, square footage, market appetite, the premium attached to colonial revival details. Clive asked the right questions without pressing too far. How many joint owners, when the house was last appraised, whether the neighborhood association was as fussy as its reputation suggested. "You could command a figure well above the last sale on your street," he said, resting his hand lightly on the arm of his chair, "especially if you're ready to move quickly." Maggie smiled, not confirming, not denying. "I like to know what my options are." When they parted, he tipped his head in a small bow. "You know how to find me." That evening, David called. His voice had the weary tilt it always did after a day stretched thin between work and whatever Brittany demanded. He asked if she was free for dinner later in the week. "I might be," Maggie said, letting the pause carry just enough lightness to sound casual. She mentioned the weather, a recipe she was trying, the new hydrangeas blooming out front. Nothing about deeds or cash buyers. David laughed at something small she said, and she let herself laugh back. The rhythm between them felt almost normal. But when she hung up, she walked to the hall table, slid open the drawer where her notebook waited, and wrote a single line beneath "Call Clive Warren." "Decide what this house is worth. To me." The long harvest table gleamed under the chandelier, a sheet of polished walnut stretching between the kitchen and the front parlor. Maggie sat near the end, a place she had claimed for years, but tonight the chair felt further from the center of things. Brittany was in her element, shoulders back, hair swept into a style that probably had a name, moving around the table like a hostess in a magazine spread. A bottle of Chardonnay breathed beside her elbow, its label turned toward the couple seated across from Maggie. "Savannah's full of people who think they can just drift into a nice neighborhood and stay," Brittany was saying, her voice dipped in honey but edged with something harder. "It's one thing if you're contributing, quite another if you're just enjoying the view." Her eyes never landed directly on Maggie, but the air between them caught every syllable. Maggie took a slow sip of tea. It was hot enough to make her focus on her tongue, the steam curling upward to fog her glasses for a second. She set the cup down with precision. Across from her, David was busy carving roast chicken, his gaze locked on the meat as though precision there could keep the evening from unraveling. He asked one of the guests about their gardenias, nodded at the answer, then went back to the chicken. Lillian, seated beside Maggie, dabbed her mouth with a napkin, then reached under the table. Her hand brushed Maggie's knee, not by accident, and something slid against Maggie's palm. She curled her fingers around it without looking. An envelope, thin but stiff, sealed. The conversation kept spinning around them. Brittany was in full sail now, telling the young couple across from her how she and David had really made the house ours. She spoke about restoring the crown molding, refinishing the floors, choosing the perfect shade of white for the exterior. "We want it to look timeless," Brittany said, fingers grazing the stem of her wine glass. "Some homes just have good bones, but they need the right people to bring them to life." The wife of the young couple murmured something approving. The husband asked if the house was difficult to maintain. "Oh, we manage," Brittany said with a little laugh. "It's our pride and joy. It's home." She lingered on the word, letting it swell in the room. Maggie smiled, the polite kind that suggested she agreed without offering proof. She tasted the smile the way she might taste a lemon seed caught between her teeth, bitter but small enough to swallow. Lillian leaned in just enough for her voice to carry over the clink of cutlery. "Open it later," she murmured. Her tone was neutral, but Maggie heard the undertow in it. The rest of the meal was a carousel of pleasant noises, silver against porcelain, low laughter, the occasional swell of Brittany's voice lifting above the others to tell another anecdote about the neighborhood association or the merits of a particular landscaper. When dessert arrived, chocolate torte with raspberry drizzle, Brittany told the table how they'd chosen the dining chairs. "We wanted something that said heritage, but still fresh," she explained. "These just spoke to me, like the house did." Maggie set her fork down, folded her hands, and let her gaze drift past Brittany to the sideboard where the china cabinet stood. The glass panes caught the light and held it like secrets. After coffee, the guests gathered their coats, thanking Brittany for the lovely evening and promising to host next time. David walked them to the door, his laugh echoing in the front hall. Maggie stayed in her seat until the sound of the latch clicked. She slid the envelope into her tote, then reached for her tea again. It was lukewarm now, the lemon wedge faded to a pale ghost at the bottom. Brittany returned, collecting wine glasses. "You know," she said lightly, "it's nice having a full table. Makes the house feel alive." Maggie's smile returned, that same neat seam of civility. "Yes," she said, "alive." She stood, her chair whispering against the rug, and moved toward the foyer. The envelope pressed against her hip with every step, a small, steady reminder that the night's most important exchange had gone unnoticed. Outside, the air was soft and thick, a hint of salt drifting in from the river. Maggie opened her car door, slid into the driver's seat, and finally broke the seal. Inside, on Lillian's stationery, was a single sheet, draft terms of sale, her share only, cash offer. The figure at the bottom was higher than she'd imagined. In the distance, through the open dining room curtains, Brittany lifted her wine glass in some private toast, smiling at her own reflection. Maggie folded the paper once, then again, her pulse calm but deliberate. This was no longer about what the house was worth to the market. It was about what it was worth to her. The rain came in low and steady that morning, drumming on the roof of Robert Ames's office like a quiet metronome. Maggie sat across from him at a walnut desk that looked older than both of them, the smell of ink and leather blotters faint in the air. The contract lay between them, thick with addendums and signature tabs. Clive Warren's name appeared in bold print at the top, Maggie's a blank line waiting below. Robert adjusted his glasses. "You've read it twice with me, once with Lillian, and I assume again on your own." His tone was careful, but it carried the faint note of someone who'd watched many clients hesitate. Maggie picked up the fountain pen Robert had set before her. It had weight, the kind of pen that knew its words would matter. She pressed the nib to the paper and wrote her name in full. Margaret Collins, the ink gliding dark and certain. "Done," she said. Robert slid the pages into a leather folder, his motions crisp. "I'll file everything with the courthouse this afternoon. You'll receive confirmation within 48 hours. After that, the closing date is binding." Lillian appeared in the doorway, an umbrella dripping rainwater into the carpet. "Binding," she repeated, pleased. She shook off her coat and set it on the stand. "That's my favorite word today." Robert handed her a copy of the contract. She tucked it into her oversized tote as if it were something she'd carry into battle. "I'll coordinate with Clive's office and set the closing. 2 weeks should do it." They left together under Lillian's umbrella, the street glossy with rain. Maggie felt no need to rush. The decision was already made. The weather could take its time. 2 days later, she drove to the Ardsley Park house under the pretense of picking up a few personal items. The garage smelled faintly of paint and motor oil, just as it had when she and David first toured the place years ago. She found the flattened cardboard boxes stacked in a corner, the kind left over from grocery store deliveries. One by one, she popped them into shape, taping the bottoms with neat strips. A box for the crystal vase from her mother, a box for the quilts she'd made in winters past, a box for the records that still smelled faintly of cedar from her old trunk. She'd just sealed the third when the side door swung open. Brittany stood there, framed in daylight, holding a shopping bag in one hand. Her gaze skimmed the stack of boxes, lingered on Maggie's tape gun. "Spring cleaning?" Brittany asked, her smile edged with amusement. Maggie straightened, dusting her palms. "Just sorting things." Brittany's tone was light, but her eyes were taking inventory. "Sometimes people box things up when they're moving." Maggie reached for another box without breaking eye contact. "And sometimes they just like order." Brittany's smile sharpened, the kind a cat might wear watching a bird hop closer. "Of course." She stepped back, letting the door close with a soft thud, her heels clicking down the hall. "That evening," David called. His voice was casual, but Maggie could hear the question beneath it. "Brittany said you were in the garage today, packing." "I told her," Maggie said evenly. "I'm just sorting things." "Right," he said, dragging the word out just a fraction. "Well, good." She could almost see him nodding, the conversation already moving in his mind to safer ground. They talked briefly about the rain, about a new cafe he'd tried near the courthouse. Not once did she mention contracts, filings, or the calendar marked in red on her kitchen wall. In the garage the next morning, the boxes sat in neat rows against the wall, their flaps folded and ready. Maggie stood looking at them for a moment, her keys cold in her hand. From somewhere inside the house, Brittany laughed, a short, satisfied sound, as if she'd already decided she knew exactly what game Maggie was playing. Maggie smiled to herself, locking the door behind her. Brittany thought she was calling a bluff. The truth was, the cards were already on the table. The envelope sat on the passenger seat as Maggie drove, its weight out of proportion to the single sheet of paper inside. Pale cream, heavy stock. Robert insisted on making things look as formal as they were final. The sky was a flat gray, the kind that pressed low and seemed to listen. She pulled into the brick drive, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Through the dining room window, she saw movement. Brittany crossing the room, phone in one hand, a mug in the other. Maggie got out, the gravel crunching under her shoes, and walked to the door. She didn't knock. She still had a key. David was at the kitchen island, sleeves rolled, flipping through mail. Brittany was leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone. When she saw the envelope in Maggie's hand, her smile froze mid-curve. "What's that?" Brittany asked, straightening. "It's for David," Maggie said, setting it on the counter in front of him. David's brow furrowed. He opened it, scanning the page. His eyes moved faster than usual, then stopped. He looked up. "You're selling your share of the house?" "Yes," Maggie said. Her voice was even, not sharp. Brittany took the paper from him, eyes darting across the lines. Color drained from her face in increments, as if the blood had received the same notice and was packing to leave. "You can't," she began. But the word died, as if she'd heard her own certainty splinter. David's voice was quieter now, but the edges were there. "Are you really doing this?" Maggie met his eyes. "Yes. I am." The silence that followed was brittle. Brittany set the paper down as though it might bite. She turned toward the sink, busying herself with nothing. Maggie didn't stay long. She'd come to deliver, not to debate. That afternoon, Lillian was at her apartment, sleeves rolled, packing newspaper around the edges of Maggie's crystal vases. Start with the things you don't want them touching, she advised. You'll feel better seeing them gone. They worked in steady rhythm, Maggie labeling boxes in her neat looping script while Lillian wrapped and stacked, the apartment filled with the dry, faint smell of cardboard and ink. You know, Lillian said, taping a box shut, Robert told me this morning that everything's in order. Once they see that signature on file, they'll understand there's no turning it back. Maggie allowed herself a small smile. Robert's good at reminding people what binding means. Later, they met Robert at his office. He stood behind his desk, jacket off, shirt sleeves crisp. I've received confirmation from the courthouse, he said. Your contract is on record. Closing date is in 12 days. They can't interfere. Not that it'll stop them from trying, Lillian said. Robert's mouth curved faintly. Trying is free. Changing it is impossible. Maggie felt the certainty settle deeper into her bones. She thanked him, tucked the copies he handed her into her bag, and stepped back out into the street. The air smelled faintly of rain again, like the day she'd signed the papers, only now the clouds felt lighter, the horizon wider. At the house that evening, a single light burned in the garage. Maggie stepped inside to collect another box and found Brittany standing there, arms crossed, the notice lying open on the workbench. You think you're scaring me, Brittany said, her voice low but tight. Maggie lifted the box without answering, feeling its weight balance against her hip. She walked past Brittany toward the door. Brittany's gaze followed her, sharp as cut glass. You're making a mistake. Maggie paused in the doorway and looked back, not with anger, but with something closer to patience. No, she said. I'm correcting one. Then she stepped out into the dusk, the sound of Brittany's breath catching behind her, as though the walls of her certainty had just begun to crack. The doorbell rang just after 10, the chime echoing sharp and clear through the house. Maggie stood in the front hall, a slim folder in her hand, and opened the door to find Clive Warren framed against the pale morning. His white carnation was crisp against his jacket lapel. Beside him stood a man in a navy windbreaker, clipboard tucked under one arm. Mrs. Collins, Clive said with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been refused entry. This is Mr. Adair. He's here for the inspection. Before Maggie could answer, Brittany's voice cut from the living room. What's going on? Her heels clicked on the hardwood as she approached. The moment she saw Clive, her expression thinned to something brittle. No one told me about an inspection today. I did, Maggie said evenly, stepping aside to let them in. Brittany's mouth twitched, the way people's do when they can't decide whether to fight or pretend they don't care. She chose the latter, at least for now, turning on her heel with a toss of hair that caught the light. Moments later, a door upstairs slammed hard enough to rattle the chandelier crystals. Clive gave a courteous half-smile, as if acknowledging the performance without inviting commentary. Mr. Adair opened his clipboard, pen poised, eyes scanning the trim and crown molding as though he could see every nail beneath the paint. They moved from room to room. Living room, dining room, kitchen, Adair murmuring notes to himself, occasionally kneeling to check outlets or pressing a level against the baseboards. Somewhere above them, Brittany's footsteps crossed and recrossed the floorboards, her presence a storm cloud in heels. Halfway through the inspection, the music started, loud, thumping bass, shaking the light fixtures in time with a pop singer's voice. Maggie caught Clive's raised brow. I suppose she has strong feelings about visitors, Maggie said. Every house has its weather, Clive replied smoothly, trailing after the inspector. When they reached the dining room, Maggie slipped into the kitchen and returned with a tray, white porcelain cups, a small pot of tea, sugar, lemon slices in a glass bowl. She set it on the table with the same precision she'd once reserved for Sunday dinners. Gentlemen, something to take the edge off the noise? She asked. Adair looked up from his notes, clearly startled by the offer. That's very kind, ma'am. Clive took a cup, inhaled as if testing the tea's aroma. Charm like this doesn't come with new construction, he said, glancing toward the high ceilings, the deep crown molding. You can't fake a soul. Upstairs, the music cut off mid-chorus, as abruptly as if a plug had been yanked from the wall. Seconds later, Brittany appeared in the doorway, face tight. Done yet? She asked. Not quite, Adair replied without looking at her. scribbling a final note before stepping into the hallway. Clive set his empty cup on the tray. "We won't be much longer." Brittany's lips parted as if to reply, then pressed into a thin line. She turned and climbed the stairs again, her tread sharper this time, the air behind her cooling by degrees. When the inspector stepped outside to check the porch supports, Clive lingered with Maggie in the front hall. "She's spirited," he said lightly, though his eyes held a glint of calculation. Brittany took to stalking from room to room with her phone in hand, filming evidence for anyone willing to watch her stories online. "This is unlivable," she said on repeat, the words sharp enough to cut but dulled by overuse. David stayed late at the office when he could. When he was home, he nodded through her tirades, answering in monosyllables, as though every response was a minefield. On Friday, a cream envelope arrived in the mail slot, Clive's name in the corner. Brittany tore it open at the kitchen counter, scanning quickly. Her voice went up an octave. "Rent adjustment? He's raising our rent for the common spaces?" David took the paper from her, reading the short, neat paragraph. "Says it reflects the increased value after improvements. It's within his rights." Brittany stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "So we just pay it? Or we move?" David said softly. Her laugh was humorless. "Oh, he would love that." While the dust thickened at Ardsley Park, Maggie's new condo remained a sanctuary. Morning light spilled across her small dining table, warming the pale blue china cup she favored for coffee. She'd opened the balcony door to let in the air, soft, river-scented, carrying only the faint hum of the city. Her boxes were unpacked, her books shelved in careful order. A vase of white camellias sat near the window, their petals unmarked by dust. When her phone pinged with a message from Lillian, she smiled before even opening it. The photo showed the Ardsley Park dining room mid-demolition, drywall down to the studs, wires dangling like vines. Beneath the picture, Lillian had typed, "Clive's crew says 2 more weeks. She's on her 3rd emergency hair appointment this week." Another followed, Brittany in the background of a shot, mid-gesture, her mouth open in what was surely a complaint. The caption read, "Volume at maximum." Maggie chuckled, setting the phone aside. She poured herself more coffee and turned a page in her book. But late that afternoon, another photo arrived. This one had no caption, just the image. A corner of the Ardsley Park porch, swept clean, with a newly painted door and a brass nameplate reading Warren and Collins. Maggie stared at it for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the phone screen. The name gleamed even in the photograph, catching sunlight like a signal. She knew Brittany would see it the same way. The first hint came when the mover's truck idled at the curb outside the Ardsley Park house, its hazard lights winking against the white columns. Brittany, in yoga pants and a silk blouse, stepped onto the porch with her phone pressed to her ear. She watched as 2 men carried a mahogany headboard through the front gate. Inside, Clive stood at the base of the staircase, a leather overnight bag at his feet. "Master suite's ready," he told the foreman. "Let's set the bed first, then bring in the desk." Brittany's heels clicked fast on the hardwood as she came in from the porch. "I'm sorry, what?" "I'll be taking the master," Clive said, his tone almost cheerful. "Better light, private bath, makes sense." "That's our bedroom," she snapped. Clive glanced at her, his smile polite but absent of apology. "Co-owners have equal claim. I'm moving in today." David emerged from the kitchen, already loosening his tie. "Clive, can we talk about this? The suites—" "Already decided," Clive said, turning to the movers. "Careful with that armoire." Brittany's voice pitched higher. "Where exactly do you expect us to sleep?" "There's a perfectly good guest room down the hall," Clive replied, as if offering a favor. By that evening, their clothes were stacked in boxes outside the master bedroom door. The guest room was half the size, its single closet crammed before Brittany had finished unpacking. She paced the hall, phone in hand, narrating her outrage to anyone willing to answer. David kept his head down, folding shirts into drawers that stuck when you closed them. The next morning, Clive's work boots thudded on the stairs as he left for the day. Brittany seized the moment. "David, we can't just let him—" "I already tried," David said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He's not budging. He quoted the co-owner agreement verbatim. Then we fight it. With what? His voice was weary now. It's in writing, Britt. He's within his rights. She stared at him, the silence between them stretching as long as the hall. Across town, Maggie sat on her balcony, the morning air warm but edged with a breeze off the river. Her tea cooled beside her as she read Lillian's latest text. He's in the master. They're in the guest room. I can hear her screech from here. Maggie smiled faintly, scrolling to the attached photo, a grainy shot through a second-story window, Brittany's profile mid-argument, her hand slicing the air. She set the phone aside and bent over a row of clay pots lined neatly along the railing. The rosemary had taken to its new home, the basil was already putting out tender green leaves, and the thyme needed just a pinch of dried soil brushed from the rim. Lillian arrived with a paper sack from the farmer's market, setting it on the balcony table. "Got you a starter for mint," she said. "Thought it might suit your tea." Maggie took it, pressing the leaves between her fingers to release the scent. Perfect. They worked side by side, tucking the new plant into the soil, pressing it firm, the city's hum low and steady around them. Back at Ardsley Park, Brittany stood in the stripped guest room, hands on hips, staring at the single narrow window. Down the hall, the master suite door was closed, light spilling in a warm strip across the polished floor. Her reflection in the glass was thin and sharp, as if even the room itself was narrowing around her. She picked up her phone, scrolling for the contact she never thought she'd call, her tone when she finally spoke low, measured, and dangerous. "I need advice," she said, "about how to make someone leave." The first month's bill from Clive arrived in a cream envelope with a gold-embossed return address. Inside was a single sheet, numbers neatly lined in columns, no explanation beyond proportional share of household expenses. Brittany scanned it at the kitchen counter, her nails clicking against the paper. "This is—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "David, this is insane. He's charging us for utilities now, and the rent adjustment, and what even is this line? Maintenance reserve?" David took the bill from her, his tie already loosened, eyes tired from another late night. "It's everything we use in the common areas. Heat, lights, cleaning, his improvements. He warned us. He's robbing us. He's billing us." The silence between them was heavy enough to hear the refrigerator hum. By the second month, Brittany's credit card bills had begun stacking in a drawer she didn't open when David was home. The spa appointments were trimmed back to one every other month. The weekend brunches with the girls vanished from her calendar. She still wore the silk blouses, but they hung differently without the dry cleaner's crispness. David, meanwhile, stayed at the office later each week, picking up extra cases, filling in for colleagues, anything that might keep the lights on, both at home and in the fragile peace between them. Some nights Brittany sat alone in the guest room, scrolling through photos of the house from when it had felt like hers. The images glowed on her phone, but the sound of Clive's boots upstairs always brought her back to the present. Across town, Maggie moved with quiet purpose. The condo's living room had a soft brightness now, plants thriving in their terracotta pots, sunlight painting the hardwood floors in slow-moving patterns. One Thursday afternoon, she opened a linen-lined box from her storage closet, the fine china she'd once hoped would be part of family dinners. She lifted a plate, the cobalt rim cool beneath her fingers, the gold wheat pattern still gleaming. That night she called the director of the local historical society's charity auction. "I'd like to donate something special," she said. The auction took place in the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, the air scented faintly of roses and champagne. Maggie stood near the back, watching as the lot came up. A 12-piece set of china described by the auctioneer as a classic in pristine condition, perfect for any table that means something. The bidding began briskly. Maggie spotted Lillian across the room, hand raised with casual certainty. Another bidder countered. Lillian raised again. The back and forth was short, decisive. When the gavel came down, Lillian's smile was small but sure. She signed the slip, collected the box, and crossed the room toward Maggie. "For you," she said, pressing the handle into Maggie's hand. I know you didn't. But I did. Some things belong in the right hands. That evening, Maggie unpacked the plates in her kitchen, placing each one in the glass-fronted cabinet she'd chosen for the condo. The cobalt rims caught the lamplight, throwing back a soft glow. She set 2 places at her small dining table, tea for herself, wine for Lillian, and they sat in comfortable quiet. "You realize," Lillian said after a while, "she's going to find out you have them again." "I hope she does," Maggie replied, pouring more tea. The plates gleamed between them, perfect in their places, untouched by dust or pettiness. In the guest room at Ardsley Park, Brittany flipped through her mail and froze at a glossy flyer tucked between bills, "Spring Gala and Charity Auction. Thank you to our supporters." On the back was a photo of the china set, her china framed in gold filigree, under the caption, "Purchased by Lillian Price, gifted to Margaret Collins." Her hands tightened on the paper until the edges bit into her palms. The cafe was tucked on a quiet corner near Forsyth Park, its windows fogged slightly from the steam of espresso machines and the low murmur of late-morning patrons. Maggie arrived first, choosing a small table near the back where the sunlight fell in a clean rectangle across the worn wood. She ordered tea and watched the door. David appeared a few minutes later, looking like he'd left work in a hurry, shirt sleeves rolled, tie loosened, a line of fatigue between his brows. "Mags," he said, half smiling as he slid into the seat across from her. "David." She closed the menu she hadn't been reading. "What's on your mind?" He glanced toward the counter, then back at her. "Brittany feels disrespected." Maggie let the words sit. She stirred her tea slowly, watching the swirl of amber in the cup. "Does she now?" "She thinks the way everything's happened, the sale, Clive moving in, the China, it's like you're making a point." Maggie set down the spoon. "She disrespected me first, David, from the very beginning." He shifted in his seat. "I'm not saying she's perfect. She told me I wasn't family," Maggie said, voice low but steady. "In my own home, that was the point where I stopped making allowances." David rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking toward the window where a young couple strolled past with coffee cups. "The house is tense, every day. She's upset, Clive's doing whatever he wants, and I'm in the middle." "That's where you put yourself," Maggie replied, not unkindly. "I offered civility, I offered patience. Both were refused." He looked down at the table, tracing the grain with one finger. "It's just a lot." Maggie reached for her tea, letting the warmth settle in her hands. "You're right, it is a lot, and most of it was avoidable." They fell quiet as the waitress passed with a tray of cappuccinos. Maggie sipped her tea. David drank black coffee without tasting it. The cafe's background hum filled the space between them. Spoons clinking, pages turning, a distant hiss of steaming milk. After a while, David stood, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice softer now. "Of course," Maggie replied. They stepped outside together, the air cooler than when they'd arrived. David hesitated on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. "I'll keep you posted," he said. Maggie nodded. "Do that." He walked away toward the square, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though the space between home and elsewhere had no shelter. Maggie watched until he turned the corner, then crossed the street in the opposite direction, the quiet weight of their conversation following her like a shadow. Back at her condo, the phone on her counter was already buzzing. The caller ID read Lillian. The listing went live on a Thursday morning, just after sunrise. The photos gleamed on the real estate site, sunlight flooding through the arched windows, polished hardwood shining like poured honey, the front porch framed in climbing roses. In bold type beneath the images, $2.85 million, cash buyers only. By the time Brittany saw it, she'd already been tagged in 3 neighborhood group posts. She sat on the edge of the guest room bed, phone trembling in her hand. "David," she called, voice pitched high, "he's selling the house." David appeared in the doorway, tie draped around his neck. "What?" She thrust the phone at him. "Look, he's already had the photos taken. He's asking for millions. Where are we supposed to go?" David stared at the listing a long time before speaking. "It's his right, Britt. He owns half. He can sell to whomever he wants. This isn't happening, she said, pacing. It's not happening. That afternoon, David called Maggie. His voice had the hesitant weight of someone asking for help they knew they wouldn't get. She's panicking, he said. About the house. Clive's listed it high, cash only. We don't know what to do. Maggie, sitting at her kitchen table with the late light spilling across her hands, didn't rush her answer. I hope you find a nice place, she said. There was silence on the line. That's it? David asked. That's it. The next evening, Lillian was on Maggie's balcony, a bottle of Prosecco sweating in an ice bucket. She popped the cork and poured. To holding your ground, she said, raising her glass. Maggie clinked hers against it. And to knowing when to stop talking. They drank, the city lights blinking on below them, the hum of traffic softened by distance. Sunday brought the open house. Maggie, dressed deliberately, wide-brimmed hat, dark sunglasses, linen dress that whispered when she moved. In the mirror, she looked less like herself and more like a woman browsing possibilities. The street outside Ardsley Park was lined with cars. A white sign with gold lettering read, Open House Today, Warren Realty Group. She stepped through the front door as if she were a stranger, nodding politely to the young agent stationed in the foyer. The air inside smelled of polished wood and faint citrus cleaner. The master suite, Clive's suite, was staged with crisp white bedding and a vase of fresh lilies. The parlor gleamed, the furniture arranged for symmetry and space. Even the dining room, once the backdrop to so many brittle dinners, felt lighter, stripped of its old tension. Maggie walked slowly, her fingertips grazing the smooth banister as she climbed the stairs. In the guest room, Brittany stood stiffly beside the closet, arms crossed. Her eyes met Maggie's for a fraction of a second before she turned away. Maggie didn't speak. She only looked once toward the window, the same view she'd known for years, and then back toward the hall. On her way out, she caught sight of Clive speaking with a well-dressed couple in the foyer. He spotted her, and the corner of his mouth lifted, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. She stepped into the sunlight, the faint echo of voices trailing behind her. At the curb, she removed her sunglasses for just a moment, looking back at the house. For the first time, it didn't feel like something being taken from her. It felt like something she'd already left behind. But as she turned away, she noticed another car pulling up. A black sedan she didn't recognize. The driver stepped out, phone in hand, scanning the house with the kind of calculating interest she knew all too well. Something in her gut told her this was not just another potential buyer. The sale closed on a mild afternoon in early spring, the kind of day when the light seemed to soften the edges of everything it touched. Maggie hadn't gone to the courthouse herself. There was no need, but Robert had called her that morning to let her know it was official. The new deed bore a name she recognized immediately. Charles Merriweather. They had first met years ago at a Preservation Society fundraiser, back when Maggie was still hosting dinners in the Ardsley Park dining room. He had been genial, quick to notice details in architecture, and shrewd in the way he spoke about investment properties. When he called her the evening before to say he was the mystery buyer, she had been genuinely surprised. It's a beautiful house, he'd said, his voice carrying that measured calm she remembered. But I'm not looking to live there full-time. I'm thinking of renting out rooms, selectively, to people who appreciate history and won't complain about a creaky stair or a draft in winter. Maggie had smiled to herself at that. You'll be able to fill the rooms easily, she'd replied. It's a house that draws people in, though sometimes it keeps the wrong ones. Now, less than 24 hours after the ink had dried, Charles's property manager was walking up the front path with a sheaf of envelopes. Brittany answered the door, her expression already wary from the sight of an unfamiliar face. The envelope she was handed was printed on thick stock, the return address in tidy serif type. Inside was a formal notice, 30 days to vacate. The language was concise, almost cordial, explaining that the new owner intended to reconfigure the property for tenant use and that the current arrangement would end on the stated date. Brittany read it twice before calling for David. Her voice carried down the hallway, high and sharp, and when David appeared from the study, she pushed the paper into his hands. 30 days, she said, as though the number itself were an insult. 30 days to find somewhere to go. He can't do this. David scanned the letter, his jaw tightening in that way Maggie had seen so many times before when he was caught between outrage and resignation. He can, he said quietly. It's legal. The conversation that followed rose and fell in volume, but the walls of Ardsley Park had always been good at holding sound. Neighbors out walking their dogs glanced toward the house when Brittany's voice pitched higher, though no one lingered long enough to hear the particulars. A few mornings later, Maggie returned to the house, not for business, but because she wanted to see the garden one last time before it was changed by someone else's vision. The iron gate still swung open with the same familiar groan, and the flagstone path curved ahead just as it had for years. Spring had woken the camellias, and their blooms, pale pink and cream, leaned heavily on their stems. She moved slowly, her shoes brushing against the grass, stopping to run her fingertips over the rosemary hedge she'd planted long ago. In the center bed, the climbing roses were already reaching upward, their new growth vivid against the trellis. Maggie breathed in the scent, letting the mingled notes of earth and blossoms linger before stepping onto the back porch. The kitchen door was propped open for the breeze. Inside, she noticed the china cabinet in the dining room, once crowded with dishes for every occasion, now stood completely empty. The glass panes reflected the room in fragments, catching her own outline as she crossed to the doorway. The absence inside the cabinet was stark, but it was not surprising. The set Clive had left behind was long gone, and whatever remained of Brittany's had been packed away. That evening, Lillian stopped by Maggie's condo with a bag of lemons from her yard. They sat at the small dining table, a pot of tea between them, the windows open to the cool air. Maggie told her about the notice, about Charles's plan for the house, and about the bare cabinet. Lillian laughed, the sound low and warm. "Full circle," she said, shaking her head. "You walked away, and now the whole thing's being emptied and remade without them having a say." She took a sip of tea, her eyes still alight. "That's the thing about control. It doesn't go to the loudest voice, it goes to the one who's willing to act." Maggie looked toward her own glass front cabinet across the room. The fine china gleamed inside, cobalt rims catching the lamplight. It was all in its place now, untouched by anyone else's claim. Outside, the evening deepened, the air carrying the faint scent of the river and distant magnolia blooms. Maggie listened to it, unhurried, knowing that some endings don't arrive with a slam or a shout, but with the quiet certainty that you are no longer the one who has to fight for the keys. The first time Maggie spent a weekend back in the Ardsley Park Master Suite, it felt less like returning and more like stepping into a chapter she had deliberately closed, then chosen to reopen on her own terms. Charles had insisted, with the casual generosity of someone who knew the gesture cost him nothing, that she should make use of the room whenever she pleased. "It's too fine to sit empty," he'd said, handing her a set of keys in a small leather case. The suite had changed since Clive's tenure. Charles had replaced the heavy drapes with gauzy linen panels that caught the light, and the bedding was crisp and cool, the sort that whispered when you smoothed it down. Still, Maggie knew the bones of the room. The curve of the molding above the bay window, the faint hollow in the floorboard near the wardrobe, the way the light from the west poured in like molten gold just before sunset. On Saturday morning, she rose early, opened the windows wide, and let the warm air drift in. The scent of the garden below reached her, roses and rosemary mingling with the faint salt of the river breeze. She made tea in the small sitting area off the bedroom, the porcelain cup warm between her hands, and sat in the chair nearest the window, listening to the house settle. By late morning, Lillian arrived, sweeping in with a wicker basket hooked over her arm. Inside were scones wrapped in linen, a jar of peach preserves, and a small bouquet of mint from her garden. "I thought we'd do it properly," she said, her voice bright in the stillness. They carried everything to the dining room, where Maggie had already set the long table with her fine china. The cobalt rims glowed against the white linen cloth, the gold wheat pattern catching and scattering the light that streamed in through the tall windows. She poured the tea, the steam curling in the air, while Lillian arranged the scones on a tiered stand as if they were staging a photograph. "Feels different," Lillian said, glancing around the room. "It is different," Maggie replied. She took in the details, the polished wood, the uncluttered sideboard, the chandelier crystals flashing in the sunlight. "It's mine now, in the way that matters." They talked easily, their voices weaving with the sounds of summer outside. Bees hummed in the garden beyond the glass, and the soft rustle of leaves was occasionally broken by the distant chatter of someone passing along the sidewalk. Time slowed in that room, settling around them like the warmth of the tea in their cups. After lunch, Maggie walked out into the garden. The flagstones were warm under her sandals, and the camellias leaned toward the sun, their petals already blushing with the first hints of deeper summer. She paused by the rosemary hedge, pressing her fingertips lightly to the fragrant leaves, and let the sound of the insects fill the air around her, a steady, contented thrum. When she returned to the dining room, the table was bathed in late afternoon light. The plates gleamed beneath the chandelier, each one reflecting a perfect oval of gold from the prisms above. Lillian had stepped out to take a phone call on the porch, leaving Maggie alone in the room. She rested her hand lightly on the back of one chair, letting her eyes travel the length of the table. This was no longer the site of careful silences and brittle conversations. It had shed that skin. Now it was a room where the air moved freely, where the light touched every surface without being asked, where nothing was kept out of reach because of someone else's rules. She poured herself one last cup of tea, savoring the quiet, and thought about how much of this had been choice rather than accident. All the steps, some deliberate, some forced, had led to this moment. Her standing here, her china in place, her garden in bloom, her claim intact in the ways that counted most. When Lillian returned, they sat again, not because they needed to, but because it felt right to linger. The day outside tilted toward evening, the garden's hum softening as the light shifted. Maggie looked at the table, at the sunlight caught in the rims of the plates, and allowed herself the faintest smile. "Some tables turn themselves," she said, almost to herself. "I prefer to spin them."